Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Miss Gooding, and I'm here to talk to you about the feudal system that existed during the Middle Ages. So, as we know, the Roman Empire was incredibly powerful with infrastructure and government, and when they fell, Europe divided into multiple kingdoms, and so it was really like a tribal kind of feel in Europe. There's a lot of fighting between these kingdoms and attacks from various places, and so a new way of protecting themselves evolved, and that is what is called feudalism. So feudalism is a political and military system of the Middle Ages where land is exchanged for military service and loyalty. So the ownership of land was based on power, and land equaled money. And so if you owned land, you could charge people and tax people for living on your land. And so the people who controlled the land were the people that had the power. At the very top of this pyramid that we will talk about, because really the feudal system was a pyramid of power, was the nobility. So they were right under the king. And so these are barons, earls, dukes, and these were the people that were gifted land by the king. And they were allowed to manage the land. And so in turn, these nobles had to swear an oath of loyalty to the king. They collected taxes, and they provided soldiers when the king required them. And the king sometimes required them to fight wars and stuff like that. So the knights were the soldiers of the Middle Ages. They were highly trained, and they were called upon by the king to fight his wars when required. So they were very, very highly skilled. They were mounted knights in heavy armor, and they were known as the best defenders. They were highly skilled individuals. But they were very expensive, and so they came with weapons, armors, and horses, and so to afford that, the noble would have to pay his knights with land. And again, remember, land equals money. And so the land given to the knight in exchange for service, this was called a fief. So the knights who accepted a fief from a lord was a vassal. Okay, and so sometimes these were called vassals, and a vassal swore an oath of loyalty to their lord and would fight for him when required or when the king required him. There were also then commoners, okay, and so you have the nobility, you have the knights, and then you have everyone else. So these were the people that lived on the land. They toiled the land. Some of them were merchants, and so there were quite a few of these. So there were fewer at the top and more at the bottom. So there were more commoners than there were, of course, nobility. At the very bottom were the serfs, and the serfs was a laborer who was bound to the land. They had to have permission to leave the land. They really had they were just one step above a slave. But they worked the land for the lord and the vassals, and they paid dues in return for the use of the land. And they got to keep some of their food, but they did have to pay in order to live on the land and toil it. But they could not leave without permission. They were not a slave because they could not be sold, but they were just one step above. They also needed permission to marry, if you can believe it. Again, there were then the craftsmen and merchants, and so these were like the blacksmiths, the tailors, the bakers, the thatchers, etc. And they had more freedom than serfs, but with the rise of towns, they would rent their house or workshop from the lord, and some freedmen could rent land from the lord to farm. So they were, above the serfs, but they still struggled in some ways. All right, so here's this this hierarchy that I'm talking about. Up at the top is the monarch, then we have the nobility, we have the knights and the vassals, and then we have the commoners. And so this is really how they provide. These guys provide the food and services, these guys provide the loyalty and protection, and then these guys provide the money to the monarch. And then the monarch provides land to the nobility. The nobility provides land to the fief, or the vassals and knights. And then these guys provide land and protection to the commoners and the merchants and the serfs. Then there is the Catholic Church, which was very powerful in medieval England. The king was the ruler, but really he feared the church and the pope. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind with regards to how the king made decisions. And here's this again, but again, up here is the church, right? And the king is looking to the church for guidance. The manor is a big, huge house. And in the medieval England, a manor was more like a large estate. And the manor house would be the center of the estate, like many of them in England. And it would be where the lord or the vassal lived. Peasants' life really hard, you guys. They worked on their own to grow enough food for their families, and they also had to pay to rent the land, and so they really struggled. It was hard for them to make ends meet in many ways. The king lived in a large fortified castle, and the nobility and knights lived in smaller fortified castles, very close by to the castle itself, and most of these were made of stone. The peasants lived in shacks, mostly made of like wood and mud and dirt, and oftentimes their animals lived with them. Everyday life. It would be unlikely that a peasant would stay clean. They very seldomly washed their clothes or washed themselves. They were heavily taxed. They paid rent to their lord as tithes, meaning giving to the church, and what was left over was left to feed their family. The land sometimes became overfarmed, where they were increasing, and the famines became worse and worse and worse, which definitely affected the commoners and the serfs more than it did the upper class. And sometimes they were taxed unfairly, because if there was a famine, the nobility would still expect for taxes to come in. And so it got sometimes pretty ugly for the people at the bottom of this pyramid. So medieval peasants had a hard life. There was always work to be done. Here's kind of a list of what they had to do. So in January, they were making tools, repairing fences. February, they were carting manure. March, they were plowing and spreading manure. April was really about getting the harvest ready, or I'm sorry, so spreading seeds and stuff like that. May was digging ditches. June was haymaking. I mean, it goes on, and these guys were busy and they worked themselves to the bone. Okay. August is harvesting, where the crops were ready to pull or to cut, and yeah, it just went all year long. So here again is the feudal pyramid of power for you to see. And these are some of the questions hopefully we will have time to discuss. Thanks for listening, you guys. I appreciate it.